Greetings, fellow seekers of the forgotten past. Welcome to this quiet corner of the night, where the present fades and history begins to breathe. Before we wander into the windswept moorlands and rugged, moss-covered stone castles of medieval Scotland, I'd like to ask a small favor. Down in the comments, tell me where you are in the world and what time your clock strikes now. Are you winding down in the cozy quiet of Toronto? Just beginning your morning in Johannesburg? Maybe somewhere in between, under a sky turning from dusk to night? Wherever this moment finds you, I'm truly glad you're here. If you find comfort in these meandering, moonlit explorations through times long buried and nearly forgotten, be sure to click that subscribe button. These stories of kings and commoners, of war and wonder, will continue to unfold, and I'd love to have you with us for each step of the way. So go ahead, settle in. Nestle deeper into your blankets. Let your mind loosen its grip on the day, and prepare to drift with me into a world both fierce and fragile. A place where icy winds whistle through the heather, and the soulful wail of the bagpipes rises like smoke through the glens. Where legends walk beside shadows, and every stone has a tale to tell. The Scotland we know today, with its warm-hearted folk, flickering hearths, and rolling green hills, is a place of postcard charm. But this modern image belies a past carved from hardship. This peaceful land once echoed with war cries and wept with hunger. The Middle Ages were not a time of chivalric ballads and gallant heroes, at least not for those who truly lived through them. For the Scots of old, these centuries were shaped by brutal clan rivalries, punishing invasions, spiritual fear, and the cruel hands of famine and pestilence. Life for most was not a fairy tale. It was a relentless grind. The overwhelming majority of people, from sunup to sundown, endured lives of backbreaking labor and short-lived joys. Whether sowing barley into thin, rocky soil, defending a village from raiders, or attending Mass in freezing stone chapels, medieval Scots knew suffering not as an exception, but as the very rhythm of existence. Over the next while, as your eyelids grow heavy and the stillness of sleep creeps in, we'll lift the curtain on myths and ballads and reveal what truly lay behind them. We'll find not only struggle and sacrifice, but also incredible perseverance, love, and flashes of beauty that cut through the darkness like the northern lights. You'll meet warriors hardened by blood and weather, queens who ruled with both wisdom and steel, and villagers whose names never made it into history books, but whose lives shaped the very soul of this land. We'll walk paths once trodden by bare feet and iron boots alike, peek into the smoky homes of shepherds, and hear the murmurs of monks deep in their illuminated tomes. And together, we'll bear witness to how, through fire and frost, the Scottish spirit was tempered. But before we delve into the struggles of kings and clans, we must first set the stage. Close your eyes and envision a land untouched by the modern world. A place where nature dominates with a quiet fury. Imagine a rugged terrain where mist clings to the locks like breath to glass, and where towering mountains, silent sentinels cloaked in snow, rise from the earth like the bones of the world. Here, the highlands stretch wild and vast, their valleys carved by ancient glaciers, their ridges sharp as legends. The wind moves through them like an old song, familiar, eerie, and eternal. In the lowlands, the land softens, rolls gently into patchworks of farmland. Sheep graze lazily on hillsides. Stone cottages huddle close, their chimneys breathing smoke into the gray sky. Villages nestle in the crook of hills, built from the same stones as the earth itself. Simple churches, kirks, dot the landscape like worn bookmarks in an ancient tome. The air carries the scent of wet pine, tilled earth, and peat smoke, and it sings with the hum of unseen wings, the rustle of forests, and the distant bark of dogs tending cattle. The wilds here are alive with beasts both real and whispered. Stags with crowns of antlers dart through the trees. Boars root in thickets. Wolves, though fewer, still roam in the far reaches. Their howls a reminder that this land was never truly tamed. Overhead, golden eagles wheel on cold currents, their sharp eyes scanning the glens. At night, the stars unveil themselves in full splendor, unhindered by the lights of any city, each constellation a story once told by firelight. But for all its beauty, this land was never gentle. It was not a cradle, it was a crucible. Rival clans eyed one another across valleys with suspicion, sometimes hatred. Noble houses schemed for dominance. Borders were drawn and redrawn not with ink, but with blood. The English crown, powerful and ever hungry, cast long shadows across the southern horizon. Armies came like storms, sudden, brutal, and devastating. Homes were burned, crops stolen, families torn apart. And for the common folk, those who had no titles, no banners, no voice, life was a quiet war against the cold, the hunger, the disease, and the unpredictable moods of their lords. They found what solace they could in the cycles of planting and harvest, the comfort of kinship, and the rituals of faith. Each season brought both dread and promise. Each meal was a triumph, each birth a gamble. This is the backdrop upon which our story begins. A place of harsh truths and ancient wonder. A story of a people who, against impossible odds, endured. Their bodies bent beneath burden, but their will was iron, their spirits unbroken. As we drift into the centuries behind us, we'll watch queens kneel in prayer and warriors sharpen blades by firelight. We'll listen to farmers sing to their sheep, to poets recite verses in smoky halls, to the hush of snow falling on thatched roofs. But for now, let all that fall away. Let it become mist and music. Let the past murmur gently at the edges of your thoughts. Listen for the lullaby of the highlands, the hush of wind through heather, the soft bleating of distant ewes, the haunting tones of a lone harp carried on the breeze. Let these be your lullaby tonight. Close your eyes, weary traveler. The night is long, but your dreams are welcome here. Tomorrow, the journey begins in earnest, and you'll be ready. They survived on whatever the land could give them, scraping together what little they could cultivate or find in the forests and glens. Their meals were humble and repetitive. Porridge made from coarse oats, bitter greens gathered from the woods, perhaps a chunk of hard cheese or salted fish if fortune smiled upon them. Families huddled tightly inside their drafty, smoke-filled huts, the wind whistling through cracks in the rough timber and stone, rats rustling in the shadows, and soot darkening every beam. Yet somehow, amidst this bleakness, they found flickers of warmth, not only from the peat fires but in one another. They marked the passing of seasons with festivals that brought color to their otherwise gray lives. At Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lammas, they gathered to sing and dance under the stars. The music of fiddles, pipes, and hand drums rising into the cold night air like an incantation. Children laughed, bonfires blazed, and old songs, some ancient even then, were sung with renewed life. Around hearths glowing red, they passed down stories of heroes, of gods and spirits, of ancestors who had once roamed the same hills and fields. These tales became more than entertainment. They were a lifeline, a shared memory that told each person who they were and where they belonged. Faith, too, played a powerful role in their endurance. The rhythms of the church calendar, of saints' days and holy feasts, offered structure in a world that could so easily descend into chaos. The people found solace in ritual, the smell of beeswax and incense in the kirk, the murmur of Latin prayers they couldn't understand but nonetheless felt deeply. Even as the church demanded harsh tithes and unflinching obedience, many still turned to it for comfort, for guidance, and above all, for hope. The bonds forged within these communities were their greatest defense against despair. Neighbors shared what little they had, helped raise one another's children, tended to the sick and buried the dead. When hardship struck, and it always did, it was these human connections that held the world together. But even that solace was shadowed by the power that loomed above them all. The medieval Catholic Church, though promising salvation in the next life, was a source of fear, control, and suffering in this one. Its influence was omnipresent, woven into every part of Scottish life, from the crown of the king to the cottage of the poorest tenant. Alongside the clan system, it was the most enduring and inescapable force of the era. Its reach extended not just into the public sphere, but into the private corners of everyday life, deciding what one could believe, say, eat, wear, and even love. Every soul, from lord to laborer, was expected to tithe, often surrendering a tenth of what little they earned or harvested. These offerings supported bishops who lived in opulence, clothed in velvet and gold, dining on roasted meats while their parishioners struggled to keep starvation at bay. The church owned vast swaths of fertile land, controlling wealth and wielding legal authority equal to, if not exceeding, that of secular rulers. But it was in the moral and spiritual domain that the church's grip was tightest. It claimed dominion over the eternal souls of all, and its judgments could be both swift and merciless. To stray from official doctrine was to risk being labeled a heretic, a word that carried with it not only spiritual condemnation but physical danger. Trials were held in ecclesiastical courts where accused blasphemers faced brutal interrogations. Imprisonment, excommunication, torture, or even death by burning at the stake awaited those who dared question Rome's authority. The church's control extended into the bedroom and the family home. Marriage was considered a sacrament, and the right to marry or to divorce was tightly regulated by clergy. Couples needed permission and often payment to wed legally in the eyes of God. Women especially found themselves trapped, denied the right to leave abusive husbands, judged harshly for sexual transgressions, and often branded as immoral for behavior that strayed even slightly from strict ecclesiastical standards. Excommunication was a constant threat, casting individuals out not just from spiritual grace but from the social fabric of their communities. And yet, the church was not a monolith of cruelty. Within its walls, there were also mercy, charity, and light. Great abbeys rose from the earth like fortresses of compassion. These monasteries and convents, though under the rule of Rome, were often refuges for the poor, the sick, and the traveler. Monks and nuns provided what care they could, preparing simple medicines from herbs, feeding beggars with bread baked in stone ovens, and offering quiet shelter to those who had nowhere else to turn. Among the saints revered in Scotland, one figure shone with uncommon grace: Saint Margaret, an English princess who became Queen of Scotland in the 11th century. Margaret, driven by sincere faith and a heart inclined to mercy, labored tirelessly to bring reform and compassion to her adopted homeland. She insisted that church practices be cleaned of their inconsistencies, aligning Scottish Christianity more closely with Roman discipline. She founded monasteries, built chapels, and sponsored orphanages and hospitals. It is said she would wash the feet of the poor with her own hands and feed them at her own table. Margaret's deep piety and commitment to justice made her not just a beloved queen, but a transformative spiritual figure. She championed education, supported the preservation of sacred texts, and worked to lift up those who had been abandoned. After her death, miracles were attributed to her intercession, and she was eventually canonized, a rare honor in that age. Her name lived on, whispered in prayers by women in labor, by children at the hearth, and by widows at grave sites. Still, for every saintly act of mercy, there was a counterpoint of terror. As whispers of witchcraft and heresy grew louder, the church turned increasingly inward, anxious to root out what it saw as spiritual rot. In the 16th and 17th centuries, witch trials spread across Scotland like wildfire. Women, especially older, isolated, or outspoken ones, were accused by frightened neighbors, denounced as consorts of the devil. They were dragged from their homes, stripped, tortured, and often burned alive, their agonized cries echoing through glens and valleys. These acts were not fringe occurrences. They were sanctioned by religious courts, often encouraged by fiery sermons and legitimized by royal decrees. Witch hunting became a grim ritual, a way to explain famine, disease, or misfortune. The very faith that had once provided comfort became a blade turned inward. And so, the people of Scotland lived in constant tension, torn between loyalty to their clan and obedience to the church, between the earthy bonds of kinship and the celestial demands of faith. Their lives were shaped by institutions that offered guidance and protection, but also demanded blood, coin, and unquestioning allegiance. A misstep in either direction could lead to ruin. A disrespect shown to a clan chief might bring shame or death. A challenge to church authority could see one branded a sinner or cast out entirely. Every moment was lived under the watchful eyes of both their laird and their priest. This delicate balance between spiritual reverence and mortal fear, between family and institution, would be tested again and again. Wars would rage, plagues would come, rulers would rise and fall. But even as these mighty forces clashed, it was the common people, those bent over plows, those kneeling in cold chapels, those telling stories by the hearth, who carried the soul of Scotland forward. They endured, and in doing so, they made this land what it is. The same tightly woven clan structures that so often led to brutal internal conflict also served as the foundation for identity, pride, and survival. These clans, while capable of devastating violence against their neighbors, also provided a powerful sense of belonging, of being part of something enduring and meaningful. Loyalty to one's kin wasn't just expected. It was everything. It burned like a hearth fire in the soul, warding off the chill of poverty, loss, and fear. It gave the people purpose, connection, and the courage to keep going when the world seemed intent on crushing them. The church, too, provided order in a world ruled by chaos. Though its grip was sometimes suffocating, it gave spiritual structure to the lives of people who had so little control over anything else. Parish priests, for all their stern warnings of damnation and sin, were often the only sources of comfort and counsel in remote communities. They baptized the newborn, joined lovers in holy matrimony, heard confessions whispered in candlelit corners, and administered the last rites to those preparing to meet their end. In these moments, they weren't enforcers, they were guardians of hope. The great abbeys and priories that stood across the landscape, built with weathered stone and adorned with stained glass, were more than houses of worship. They were islands of learning and refuge in a sea of hardship. Their libraries preserved not only scripture but knowledge of medicine, astronomy, and history. Within their cloistered walls, monks illuminated manuscripts in quiet devotion, while nuns tended herb gardens, creating remedies for the sick and destitute. For many, these places offered a rare reprieve, a chance to learn, to heal, and to feel seen. One such sanctuary was Dunfermline Abbey, nestled amid ancient trees and Scottish mist, where the bones of kings were laid to rest and the breath of prayer echoed through the halls. It was here, in this solemn and sacred place, that one of Scotland's most revered figures was born, a woman whose faith and compassion would ripple across centuries. Her name was Margaret. Born a displaced English princess in the 11th century, Margaret's early life was marked by uncertainty. Yet she was raised in the heart of royal courts, educated in the classical and Christian traditions, and instilled with a powerful sense of duty and virtue. When fate brought her northward to marry King Malcolm III of Scotland, she stepped into a realm she saw as beautiful, but spiritually disordered. Celtic practices still dominated the faith in the Highlands, often blending pagan customs with Christian rituals. To Margaret, this syncretic worship was both troubling and invigorating, a challenge worthy of her devotion. With a gentle heart but a resolute will, Margaret began a quiet but powerful reformation of the Scottish Church. She insisted that the Sabbath be properly observed, that Mass be conducted with solemnity, and that fasting be respected according to Roman custom. She called upon priests to live lives of virtue, condemning those who performed sacred rites while drunk or corrupt. She reestablished discipline among the clergy and promoted literacy so that scriptures could be read, not merely recited. But her influence wasn't confined to doctrine alone. Margaret saw the suffering of the common people, those who slept on straw mats and subsisted on scraps, and she refused to ignore them. Her court became a hub of charity. She established hostels and orphanages, funded chapels, and brought over scholars and monks from the continent to help educate her new countrymen. At mealtimes, she often served the poor herself, kneeling to wash their feet in imitation of Christ's humility. Her own table was never truly hers. It belonged to those in need. Her relationship with her husband, King Malcolm, was more than political. Though he was a rough-edged warrior with little interest in piety, he adored Margaret. He reportedly had her prayer books bound in gold and would bring them back to her when she misplaced them during court duties. He listened to her counsel, moderated his harsher impulses, and became an ally in her mission to bring spiritual and civil reform to the kingdom. Together, they forged a bond not just of bloodline, but of vision. Tragically, Margaret's life ended in sorrow. In 1093, her beloved Malcolm and their eldest son were killed in battle, falling to English blades. Grief-stricken Margaret, already weakened by illness, died just days later. Her last moments were spent in prayer, clutching a crucifix, her whispers echoing into the silence of the abbey. But though her body passed, her spirit did not. Margaret was canonized in 1250 for her piety, charity, and leadership. Her memory lived on in the hearts of the Scottish people, who called upon her as a protector of mothers, children, and the poor. Pilgrims flocked to her tomb, and churches across the land bore her name. To this day, she is remembered not only as a saint, but as one of Scotland's great civilizers, a bridge between the raw tribal past and the flowering of Christian culture. Yet even Margaret's legacy couldn't fully shield Scotland from the darkness that followed. As the medieval church grew in power and prestige, so too did its capacity for cruelty. The very institutions that once nurtured the hungry began to fear dissent. Faith curdled into fanaticism. A growing paranoia around heresy and witchcraft began to infest the hearts of clergy and rulers alike. What began as isolated suspicion soon became a movement, a purge. Accusations of sorcery spread like wildfire through villages and towns. Often, they began with little more than a jealous glance, a failed harvest, or a sick child. The accused were almost always women, widows, healers, midwives, or simply those deemed different. They were seized in the night, dragged before tribunals, and tortured until they confessed to impossible crimes. Flying through the sky, cursing neighbors, dancing with devils. The methods used to extract confessions were horrifying. Thumbs crushed in iron presses, bodies bound and submerged in water. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank, they were innocent, but drowned. Confessions were read aloud in public squares before the accused were tied to stakes and set alight. The fires burned not only flesh but trust, faith, and the illusion of safety. And all of it, every scream, every execution, was sanctioned by the church and justified in the name of righteousness. This era of persecution tore at the soul of Scotland. Families turned against neighbors. Children were taught to fear those who strayed from the prescribed norms. The church, once a refuge, had become something to fear, a force that demanded absolute submission or meted out ruin. And yet, the Scottish people endured. Even as the church's light dimmed with suspicion and control, individuals carried forward the true essence of faith: kindness, sacrifice, forgiveness. In secret, they continued to practice old traditions, lighting candles not just for saints, but for lost ancestors. They whispered the prayers passed down by grandmothers, sang lullabies in Gaelic, and hid healing herbs in their gardens. In every glen and valley, there were those who resisted, not with swords or banners, but with compassion. Women who still served as midwives despite the risks. Men who read forbidden scripture by moonlight. Families who welcomed the outcast despite the whispers. So the legacy of saints like Margaret endured not because of the church's proclamations, but because of the people's memories. Because even when institutions faltered, hearts remembered. And the idea that goodness could shine even in the harshest world, that faith could be soft, nurturing, and just remained like an ember glowing beneath the ashes. In this harsh age of judgment, of burning pyres and cold altars, that ember was hope, and it never fully went out. One such enduring light in the dark tapestry of medieval Scotland was Margaret of Wessex, a noblewoman of English birth who became one of the most beloved figures in Scottish history. Born into exile and political uncertainty, she could have chosen a life of quiet retreat. Instead, she would come to reshape a kingdom. In 1070, Margaret married King Malcolm III of Scotland. Though her origins were foreign, her spirit quickly became intertwined with the land and its people. She did not regard Scotland as a distant realm to rule over, but as a home to nurture. With quiet conviction and devout purpose, Margaret set herself to a life of tireless service. To the sick, she was a healer. To the hungry, a provider. To the orphaned and abandoned, a mother in all but name. Her piety was more than private, it radiated into action. Margaret personally fed the poor, often setting aside her own meals to serve those who came begging at the gates of the royal court. She funded the construction of hospitals and shelters, ensuring that even the lowest of society had some chance of dignity and care. Education, too, was close to her heart. She believed that spiritual and intellectual nourishment went hand in hand, and she worked diligently to make learning more accessible, especially through the church. The Scottish Church at the time had become complacent and fragmented, its rites and practices a mix of older Celtic customs and loosely observed Christian rules. Margaret, who had been raised in the more disciplined Roman tradition, was appalled by the disarray. Priests who ignored fasting days, masses mumbled without reverence, monasteries more concerned with comfort than contemplation. But Margaret did not confront these shortcomings with fury. Instead, she brought reform with patience and grace. She invited respected English monks to settle in Scotland, introducing more structured liturgy and theological instruction. She emphasized the observance of sacred days and encouraged clergy to live as spiritual examples rather than overlords. Over time, her influence brought the Scottish Church more in line with Roman Catholicism. This alignment would eventually bind Scotland more closely to the papacy, for better or worse, shaping its religious identity for generations. But Margaret's legacy wasn't simply administrative, it was moral. She reminded the people, from nobles to peasants, of the higher ideals that faith should embody: humility, compassion, and sacrifice. Yet even as the church expanded in wealth and reach, it also became a source of dread, especially for the common folk. The same clergy that once fed the hungry now collected tithes with little regard for the giver's suffering. A tenth of a family's harvest might be demanded to maintain a bishop's estate. Offerings were no longer gifts, they were obligations, enforced with holy justification. As the church's authority hardened, its intolerance deepened. It began to see threats not only in outside forces but within its own congregations. Any deviation from official doctrine was met with suspicion, and suspicion all too quickly turned to accusation. Whispers of heresy, sorcery, or unorthodox beliefs could ignite a deadly fire. The medieval church was swift to act against those who strayed from its defined path. It claimed to be the guardian of truth, but often it wielded that truth like a sword. Those accused of witchcraft or theological rebellion faced the full machinery of ecclesiastical justice. Trials were often predetermined. The accused presumed guilty before speaking a word in defense. Interrogations were brutal, designed not to uncover the truth but to extract confessions. The rack, the thumbscrew, and the iron boot were not tools of faith but of fear. Guilt was found in the screams, and salvation offered only after the body had been broken. Many of the accused were women. Often they were healers who knew the secrets of herbs, midwives who dared to help women outside of church-sanctioned structures, elderly widows with no family to protect them, or simply women who spoke too boldly or lived too independently. A look, a rumor, a misfortune in a village, a cow's death, a failed crop, could be enough to set suspicion alight. The punishments were as public as they were cruel. Executions were conducted in marketplaces before crowds of neighbors and children. Victims were paraded through streets, jeered at, shamed, and ultimately killed, most often by fire. To the church, this was purification. To the people, it was a terrible warning. Obey, conform, or perish. And yet, even as the church's darker instincts grew stronger, figures like Margaret remained enduring symbols of what faith could be at its best. Her memory was a balm. Pilgrims still visited her tomb, lighting candles and whispering prayers. Mothers invoked her name during childbirth. The sick prayed for her intercession. In times of great fear, her gentle legacy stood in stark contrast to the church's harsh punishments. Margaret's story also reveals something essential about power, that even in systems prone to corruption, individuals can enact change. Her strength lay not in violence, but in conviction. She ruled through influence, not fear. Her quiet reforms rippled outward, touching the high priests and the lowly peasants alike. Still, the culture of suspicion and persecution escalated throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Witch hunts became almost routine. In some villages, entire families were wiped out. Testimonies extracted under torture were treated as gospel. Confessions were read aloud in courts, detailing imagined midnight Sabbaths, demonic pacts, and fantastical crimes. Truth became irrelevant. What mattered was conformity and control. It's important to remember that these horrors weren't confined to cities or distant kingdoms. They unfolded in cottages beside locks, in crofts nestled between the hills. The same hands that offered bread at Mass might later point in accusation. And sometimes those accused were the very people who had once been praised for their healing or wisdom. And so the Scottish people, ever resilient, learned to live under the twin weights of spiritual authority and social fear. They maintained faith not in institutions, but in symbols, not in the rigid hierarchy of clergy, but in the saints they remembered with love. Margaret, gentle and luminous, remained one such beacon. She was everything the church had claimed to be, but rarely was. In the midst of darkness, her story endured like a single candle against the void. And even as fire consumed others unjustly, the flame she lit refused to be extinguished. Though the Highland clans were often locked in cycles of vengeance and rivalry, there were moments, brief but deeply cherished, when unity and shared identity triumphed over bloodshed. Great gatherings, festivals, and seasonal rituals brought entire clans together in celebration. For a short time, feuds were forgotten, swords were sheathed, and music filled the glens. These were times when even the poorest crofter felt part of something far larger than himself. A kinship not just of blood, but of culture, history, and land. At the heart of these communal moments were the clan chiefs. Though often embroiled in disputes and battles, they saw themselves as more than mere warriors. They were leaders of men, guardians of ancestral pride and keepers of tradition. They held their lineage as sacred and upheld their place as custodians of Gaelic knowledge, poetry, and law. Their role was not just political, it was spiritual, cultural, and deeply personal. In the great halls of their strongholds, where torchlight flickered on stone walls and the scent of meat and peat smoke mingled in the air, these chiefs hosted feasts that celebrated the enduring spirit of their people. Here, bards stood tall and recited ancient epics in the lilting cadence of the Gaelic tongue. Their voices, powerful and rhythmic, wove stories of old battles, great loves, tragic losses, and the mystical forces of the land. The wire-rung harpists and musicians plucked haunting melodies that echoed through the rafters like memories come alive. These chieftains prided themselves as patrons of the arts and craftsmanship. Under their protection flourished a vibrant material culture. Weavers created intricate tartans unique to each clan, patterns that told stories in their colors and lines. Armorers forged gleaming dirks and swords, not just for war but for display, as badges of honor. Silversmiths cast brooches and torques, embedding them with symbols of power, lineage, and faith. These items weren't merely adornments. They were expressions of identity, resilience, and belonging. But we must not let these cultural flourishes blind us to the brutal realities that defined Highland life. This was no romantic idyll. Life in the glens was hard, unforgiving, even from the highest chief to the humblest tenant. All were at the mercy of the land and the seasons. One failed harvest could bring hunger. A murrain, a cattle plague, could erase a clan's wealth overnight. Illness struck without warning, often without cure. Even a mild winter could kill. Men and women aged before their time, their bodies worn by toil and malnutrition. Children were lucky to see their 5th birthday. The strongest often became victims of warfare, accident, or exposure. Death was not an exception. It was a familiar companion. Every household had stories of lives lost too soon, of winters endured with only scraps to eat, of mothers weeping for sons who never returned from raids. Violence, too, was never far. A peaceful glen might be quiet one day and echo with screams the next. Clans clashed over grazing land, stolen cattle, or ancestral slights. Skirmishes erupted with terrifying speed. Raids were swift and savage, often launched under the cover of night. Crofts were burned, livestock taken. Those who resisted were cut down without mercy. Even in sleep, Highlanders remained half alert, swords never far from reach, ears trained to catch the first signal of alarm. Cow horns and shouted warnings could call an entire village to arms in moments. Women gathered children and essentials, fleeing to the nearest tower while the men rallied to defend the clan's honor. Such was the rhythm of life. Feast and famine, laughter and mourning, beauty and brutality, all inseparable. And yet, in the face of such hardship, the Highlanders found meaning. They embraced a fierce independence and cultivated a loyalty to clan and land that defied external threats. This was a people who knew suffering intimately, but who still danced beneath the stars, still sang songs by firelight, still believed in magic and memory. Clanship wasn't just a political or familial structure, it was the very fabric of Highland life. The clan was one's protector, one's legacy, one's reason to fight and survive. To be clanless was to be unmoored, vulnerable, and nameless in a harsh world. Kinship was safety, status, and spiritual grounding. The structure of the clan was hierarchical but deeply interconnected. At the top stood the chief, whose authority rested on respect and mutual obligation rather than absolute rule. Beneath him were the tacksmen, lesser nobles or senior kinsmen who managed land and resources, often leading small bands of warriors in the chief's name. Then came the tenants, who farmed the land and provided goods, services, and martial support. At the base were the cotters and laborers, those with little or no land of their own, who worked as hired hands, shepherds, or craftsmen. Service to the clan was total. Tribute was paid in kind: grain, wool, livestock. In return, the chief offered protection, mediation in disputes, and a place in the social order. But this was no benevolent utopia. Chiefs could be ruthless, their decisions law. Those who displeased them risked exile, punishment, or worse. Power had to be continually earned and asserted. The chieftainship itself could be contested. Many clans faced bitter internal rivalries, with cousins or distant branches challenging the rightful heir. Nevertheless, the clan system endured for centuries because it offered something that neither crown nor church could fully replace: a sense of rootedness, of purpose. It was this fierce loyalty that often made the Highlands ungovernable to outsiders. English kings and even lowland Scottish monarchs struggled to bring the Highland clans under centralized control. For the Highlander, allegiance to kin came far above loyalty to crown or state. Raiding, though violent, was seen as a legitimate means of asserting clan strength and reclaiming honor. Cattle raids, known as creeches, were common and often celebrated in song and story. They served as both economic gain and initiation for young warriors, a proving ground for courage and cunning. Of course, they also perpetuated endless cycles of revenge. Feuds could last generations, with each new chief inheriting not just lands and title, but blood debts as well. But Highland life was not only defined by the sword. It was also marked by vibrant culture, oral history, and shared memory. In every glen, there were keepers of stories, bards, scene-shave, and poets who ensured that the deeds of ancestors were not forgotten. History lived not in books, but in voices passed from one generation to the next. Through these storytellers, the past remained alive. The tales of warriors who stood alone against enemies, of star-crossed lovers, of banshees and selkies, of saints and spirits, all wove together into a shared mythology that explained the world and one's place within it. The landscape itself was sacred, filled with cairns, standing stones, and locks believed to be touched by the other world. Faith and folklore coexisted, often indistinguishably, and when rare peace came, it was savored with intensity. At festivals and gatherings, clansmen wore their finest tartans and adorned themselves with silver, brooches, and feathers. Music filled the air, bagpipes and fiddles, flutes and drums. Children danced. Elders shared ale and stories. The water of life, wistbetha or whiskey, was poured and passed in generous measure. These were the moments that kept hope alive. Fleeting though they were, they reminded Highlanders of who they were and what they endured for. Not just survival, but identity, pride, memory. And so, as we drift deeper into sleep, let us carry with us the sounds of those long-lost celebrations. The thrum of a drum, the call of the pipes, the whispered stories that stitched a people together in the face of relentless hardship. Let us remember them, not as caricatures of romantic rebellion or brutal savages, but as human beings, as a people who loved fiercely, lived vividly, and stood unyielding on a land that gave little and demanded much. As time wore on, the great edifice of medieval spiritual authority began to show its cracks. Beneath the gilded vestments, behind the cathedral walls, a slow unrest began to stir. The church, once a source of unity and solace, had grown rich, its leaders often more concerned with earthly power than heavenly virtue. Their wealth, their indulgences, their extravagant courts. These things did not go unnoticed by the people who struggled daily to survive. And from this tension, across Europe, came a ripple of reform. It began as a whisper and grew into a chorus. In Scotland's southwest, among its hills, towns, and the hearts of its working folk, those whispers found fertile ground. Here, reformist ideals took root long before Martin Luther nailed his theses to a door in Wittenberg. A century earlier, the teachings of the English heretic John Wycliffe had begun to seep across the border. Wycliffe, a man of fierce conviction, had questioned the very foundations of papal power. He preached against the sale of indulgences and the corruption of the clergy, calling instead for a return to Scripture written in the language of the people. His followers, known as ballads, crossed into Scottish lands with quiet urgency. They spoke in barns, in markets, and along winding roads. They carried with them copies of the Bible translated into the vernacular, a revolutionary act at the time. To read the Word of God in one's own tongue was to bypass centuries of hierarchy, to challenge the very notion that salvation must be filtered through priestly hands. This was not just theological theory, it was spiritual rebellion. And while the ballads were condemned, persecuted, and silenced where possible, their seeds had already taken root. Scotland's landscape, fractured by clan feuds, foreign pressures, and spiritual hunger, was ripe for a shift. The ideas that would one day ignite the Protestant Reformation had already begun to flicker in the hearts of shepherds, scholars, and stonemasons. Still, even as discontent grew, the medieval church remained a paradox. For all its corruption and cruelty, it was also a source of profound stability in a brutal age. In a time when the sword often ruled over reason, the church offered sanctuary. Quite literally, within the walls of monasteries and priories, fugitives and the desperate could find protection, granted temporary immunity from worldly retribution under the ancient law of sanctuary. It wasn't always honored, but often enough it saved lives. The monks and nuns of Scotland, though often living under the thumb of the larger ecclesiastical hierarchy, were many times voices of compassion. During harsh winters and lean summers, when famine stalked the land, their soup kitchens fed the hungry. Their gardens grew not only food but medicine. Their doors opened to the sick, the orphaned, and the forgotten. Parish priests, especially in remote areas, were more than religious functionaries. They were confidants, mediators, teachers. They baptized children, blessed unions, and buried the dead. In a world where formal education was rare, they were often the only literate figures for miles, reading letters, settling disputes, and teaching basic truths to young minds. Though few could read or write, the church preserved what little light remained from the ancient world. Within its scriptoria, Monks painstakingly copied the words of Greek philosophers, Roman historians, and early Christian thinkers. Scrolls and codices were precious, sometimes chained to stone shelves, illuminated with vibrant ink and wrapped in leather. The written word, be it sacred or classical, was treated with reverence, and without the church, it might have been lost entirely. This intellectual lifeline gave rise to scholars and reformers who would later challenge the very institution that preserved them. It was a strange irony that the hand nurturing knowledge would also be the one force to defend itself against it. As the currents of change gathered strength, the late medieval period gave way to new voices. Preachers began to question why the church owned so much land while the poor starved, why bishops rode in carriages while peasants trudged barefoot, why salvation came at a cost: coin, confession, and conformity. The common folk, though often unlettered, were not blind. They saw the contradiction between Christ's humility and the clergy's indulgence. Reformers began to call not just for cleaner rituals or better priests, but for a return to the gospel itself, a stripping away of excess, a simplification of faith. This shift was not only theological, it was deeply personal. It was a cry for a God who spoke directly to the heart, not through gold and incense, but through conscience and love. In taverns and fields, markets and hearths, the old questions began to rise again. Who speaks for God? Is it the man in robes or the voice inside each of us? These questions would not be silenced. Still, for many, the church remained their anchor. They lit candles not out of obedience, but out of longing. They knelt not in fear, but in trust. The faith of the people often shone brighter than that of their superiors. It was a quiet, humble devotion, built not in cathedrals but in cottages, in whispered prayers before sleep, in the sign of the cross over a child's forehead. The spiritual life of the average medieval Scot was layered. Yes, they heard Mass and feared damnation, but they also believed in sacred wells, in saints who walked the hills, in angels who whispered in dreams. Christianity did not fully replace the older beliefs. It absorbed them, cloaked them in Latin and liturgy, but did not erase them. The boundary between the earthly and the divine was thin. Pilgrimages were common. Journeys taken on aching feet, across wind-blown roads and treacherous passes, toward shrines said to hold relics or grant miracles. St. Ninian's Shrine at Whithorn, St. Andrew's in Fife, St. Margaret's Chapel in Edinburgh. Pilgrims carried their burdens on their backs, both literal and spiritual, hoping for healing, forgiveness, or simple peace. These were acts of faith, yes, but also acts of resistance. In a world governed by force, faith gave people the one thing rulers could not confiscate: meaning. And as change loomed, change that would fracture the church, ignite wars, and redraw the spiritual map of Europe, Scotland stood on the threshold. The embers of reform were no longer hidden. They glowed in conversations, in clandestine texts, in the courage of men and women who dared to question centuries of orthodoxy. The church, once the unshakable pillar of medieval life, was beginning to tremble, and behind every tremor was a human being, torn between fear and conviction, silence and truth, tradition and transformation. These were the final days of an age, but from their twilight, something new would rise. As the 14th century wore on, a new shadow fell across Scotland, one that came not from feuding clans or foreign crowns, but from within the very breath of the people. The plague arrived like a whisper and became a scream. It moved through ports and along trade routes, creeping silently into villages and cities, until the air itself seemed heavy with dread. The Black Death, as it would come to be called, showed no mercy and made no distinctions. Rich or poor, laird or laborer, monk or midwife, it struck with equal ruthlessness. When it came fast. First, there were murmurs, travelers falling ill, sudden deaths on merchant ships. Then entire households would vanish in days, leaving doors swinging open in the wind. The symptoms were horrifying. Swollen lymph nodes, buboes blackened and oozed. Fevers raged so high that victims babbled nonsense before slipping into unconsciousness. In its pneumonic form, the disease attacked the lungs, spreading through breath itself. Those who inhaled it could die within a single day. Scotland, already no stranger to suffering, was utterly unprepared. Medicine, such as it was, relied on leeches, bloodletting, and herbs gathered from forest paths. None of it worked. Doctors died as quickly as their patients. Priests gave last rites and then collapsed in turn. Entire monasteries were silenced. Bells that once tolled for weddings and mass now rang ceaselessly for funerals, until no one was left to ring them. Villages became ghost towns. Fields went untilled. Sheep wandered through abandoned streets. Families died together in locked homes. The living feared the dead, and worse, feared one another. The sick were shunned, left to perish alone. Loved ones abandoned burial rites, tossing bodies into mass graves out of terror and desperation. The scent of decay clung to the air. Even the strongest men wept, helpless before an enemy they couldn't fight or even see. In the face of such horror, people turned to faith, but also to fear. Wills were hastily written, with coins bequeathed for masses to be said for the soul's passage through purgatory. Men and women lined up to touch relics of saints, hoping for divine mercy. Priests led processions through empty streets, holding high fragments of bone or cloth said to protect against death. They prayed, they fasted, they wept, but the plague did not listen. Artists and poets, unable to explain what was happening, created chilling works of beauty and despair. The motif of the dance of death appeared again and again. Skeletal figures waltzing with kings, peasants, brides, and children, a grim reminder that death spared none. Literature grew darker. Songs once sung to cheer became laments. Hope dimmed like a candle in the wind. And yet, as with all storms, it eventually passed, though never fully. The plague would return in waves over the following centuries, like a tide that refused to recede. But its first blow had shattered something fundamental in the collective psyche. The people who emerged from its shadow were not the same. Paradoxically, the survivors found themselves in a changed world, one marked not only by grief, but by opportunity. With so many gone, labor became scarce. Workers could now demand better wages, more land, and greater freedom. The rigid feudal structures began to crack. The grip of serfdom loosened. A kind of strange, bitter progress grew from the soil of mass death. But the psychological cost was incalculable. Death had shown itself not as a distant promise, but a constant companion. Life felt fleeting, uncertain, like mist over the moors. People seized what joy they could, not knowing if they'd see another morning. Some turned inward, retreating to prayer and asceticism. Others turned outward into indulgence, hedonism, risk. If death would come anyway, why not dance before it arrived? Communities had to rebuild not only homes, but trust. Families were torn apart, entire lineages lost. Cities like Edinburgh and Perth, once bustling, stood eerily silent. The economy reeled, the courts slowed, and even the church, which had offered so little defense, found its authority questioned. How could an institution claiming divine favor have failed so completely to shield the faithful? In the countryside, many superstitions deepened. Strange weather, odd behavior in animals, even a bad dream. Any of these could be seen as omens of another outbreak. Some believed witches had summoned the plague. Others blamed foreigners, travelers, or sinners. The search for scapegoats began, fueling a cycle of fear and persecution that would soon erupt into more trials, more pyres. But others responded with courage. They rebuilt, brick by brick, field by field, village by village. Survivors tended graves and planted new crops. Orphans were taken in. Songs were written to remember the lost. Life, as always, found a way to return. And with this return came change. Not sudden or sweeping, but slow and deep. The trauma of the plague forced a reckoning with the structures of the old world. The unquestioned authority of the church had been cracked. The nobility, once aloof and untouchable, had shown they, too, could bleed. Commoners, those who had buried their kin with their own hands, had found a new sense of worth. A quiet revolution had begun. In this altered Scotland, the seeds of reform and resistance found new soil. People questioned more. They read when they could. They listened differently to sermons, no longer taking every word as law. The plague had not just taken lives, it had taken illusions. And with its passing, something new stirred. Not just mourning, but momentum. This would not be the last time that Scotland would be forced to reinvent itself, but it marked one of the most profound. And so, beneath the sorrow and the silence, beneath the layers of ash and memory, a new Scotland waited to be born. One forged not only in battle or belief, but in the crucible of grief. The survivors would carry this legacy, not proudly, but faithfully, because they had no choice, because to live on was in itself an act of defiance. Tonight, as you rest and listen, let that defiance settle softly over you. Let the voices of those who endured whisper across time. We lived, we suffered, but we did not disappear. Yet for all its strength and beauty, the clan system harbored deep vulnerabilities, fractures that outside forces were quick to exploit. It was a paradox. The very structure that preserved Scotland's identity also made it dangerously easy to manipulate. Kings, both in Edinburgh and across the border in London, saw opportunity in the rivalries of the Highlands. They fanned the flames of ancient feuds, rewarding loyalty not with justice, but with land and titles torn from the hands of others. This manipulation became cold policy. The infamous letters of fire and sword were royal writs granting favored clans legal permission, no encouragement to wage war on their rivals. These documents turned old grudges into sanctioned massacres. A family might go to sleep beneath a peaceful sky and wake to smoke, screams, and slaughter. Whole communities were razed in the name of royal favor. Cattle were stolen, crofts torched, fathers and sons butchered at dawn. And the king, safe in his palace, never once lifted a finger to stop it. To the Highland commoner, far from the marble courts and soft-cloaked nobles, justice was a myth. The only law that mattered was the will of one's chief and the edge of a blade. Protection did not come from the crown, nor from written statutes. It came from the strength of kin, the loyalty of one's neighbors, and the sheer cunning of those who knew how to survive in a world where betrayal and retribution walked hand in hand. For the vast majority, the crofters, shepherds, and tenant farmers, life was not a romantic Highland song. It was hard, raw, and frequently cruel. These were not the armored warriors etched in legend, but barefoot laborers with calloused hands and aching backs. They tilled soil that barely yielded crops and watched skies with hope or dread, knowing that too much rain, or not enough, could mean starvation. And always above them were the elite warriors, the chiefs and tacksmen, whose fates rarely touched the cold realities of the peasantry. Still, the people endured. They held fast to the customs and songs that connected them to the land and to one another. Storytelling was not mere entertainment, it was resistance. It reminded them that their lives, though often ignored by the powerful, mattered, that they belonged to something older than kings, a lineage, a place, a people. But the game of politics would not relent. As Scottish kings sought to centralize control, and English monarchs looked to subjugate their northern neighbors, alliances shifted like sand. A clan loyal to the king one year might be his enemy the next. Marriages were made to cement peace and quickly undone by the next generation's feud. No treaty was safe, no alliance permanent. The crown dangled rewards before ambitious chiefs, land, gold, titles, if they would only turn on their rivals. Some accepted, others resisted, and still others played both sides, weaving a dangerous path between rebellion and obedience. In this atmosphere, treachery thrived. Those seen as threats to royal authority were branded as rebels. Letters of forfeiture were issued. Lands were confiscated. Chiefs imprisoned or executed. Entire clans could be declared traitors and driven from their homes. It didn't matter if the charges were true. What mattered was obedience. Those who resisted too loudly were crushed. And so the Highlander learned to live with one eye over his shoulder and one hand on his dirk. Trust was hard won and easily lost. Honor, once the foundation of clan life, became a dangerous luxury. Survival required cunning, silence, and, when necessary, ruthless action. Among the lowlands, meanwhile, a different kind of Scotland was emerging. Towns grew, trade flourished, merchants, craftsmen, and guilds took root. The church, though wounded, still held sway. Universities opened their doors, and books began to spread new ideas. The Highlands were increasingly seen by lowlanders and foreigners alike as wild, backward, even barbaric. This cultural divide deepened tensions. The Crown, seated in Edinburgh, sought to tame the Highlands not just with arms, but with laws, language, and taxes. They pushed for English to replace Gaelic, for Presbyterian worship to replace older Catholic and folk practices, for centralized justice to displace clan arbitration. Many Highlanders saw this not as reform, but as erasure. The imposition of civilized law felt like an insult, a declaration that their way of life was inferior, that their beliefs, customs, and language were obstacles to be removed. Resentment grew, rebellion brewed. At times, these rebellions boiled over into full-blown war. At others, they simmered quietly, kept alive in songs, whispered vows, and the teaching of Gaelic words to children beside the fire. Identity became resistance, memory a weapon. The power struggle intensified. Those Highland chiefs who aligned with the crown gained protection and influence, but lost the trust of their people. Those who resisted often paid the price in blood. And still, through all this, the ordinary folk, the ones who sowed and reaped, who sang lullabies and buried the dead, kept going, carving out meaning in a world of shifting loyalties and ever-looming threat. They watched their sons taken for soldiers, their fields trampled by armies, their villages taxed, burned, rebuilt, and taxed again. And yet they continued, because what choice was there? The land itself offered no reprieve. The highlands were breathtaking, yes, but they demanded everything. Steep hills, rough soil, bitter winters, sudden storms. A single mistake could be fatal. A missed harvest, a broken ankle, a cow lost to illness. The price for error was steep. And so, beneath every clan feud and royal edict, beneath every act of betrayal or loyalty, there pulsed a deeper truth, that life here was not just about politics or power. It was about holding on, sometimes desperately, to something worth keeping. A language, a name, a stone cottage weathered by generations. This was the Highlanders' quiet defiance, that in spite of kings and wars, laws and raids, they remained. And so, as night deepens and your eyes grow heavy, carry this with you. The image of a people bound not by conquest, but by connection. Not to thrones, but to glens, to one another, to a shared history written not in books, but in blood, wind, and song. In the stubborn bloom of the thistle nestled in the heather, in the wild lament of bagpipes carried on highland winds, there lives the unshaken pride of a people forged in centuries of fire and storm. Scotland, resilient, rugged, relentless. A land where the echoes of the past still murmur through the glens and the bones of ancestors lie beneath ancient stone. A land whose spirit was tempered not in times of ease, but in the crucible of struggle. In our modern era, one softened by abundance, safety, and speed, it is easy, far too easy, to forget. We walk paved roads once soaked in blood. We sleep beneath roofs once torn off by invading hands or highland gales. We speak freely in a tongue that once faced extinction. The battles of our forebears have become stories, their pain abstract, their sacrifices distant. But forgetfulness is dangerous, for in every Scot, whether born among the islands, the valleys, or the cities, there flows a legacy written in blood and carved into the land itself. A memory older than memory, a deep, almost cellular knowing of what it took to survive. It's in our marrow, in our silence, in our sharp humor and sharper perseverance. These were not the tales of noble fantasy. These were lives lived close to the bone. Centuries when darkness was more than metaphor, it was literal. When winters were long and death came quickly. When cruelty wore a crown or a cassock. When one's fate could turn on a clan feud, a failed harvest, or the wrath of a distant king. But also when love was fierce, loyalty absolute, and hope a rebellion all its own. Those who walked before us bore more than we can imagine. They endured famine, war, plague, persecution, betrayal. They lost children, lovers, homes. They were hunted for their faith, their name, their language. and still they stood, sometimes staggering, sometimes in silence, but never fully broken. To be a medieval Scot was to live with hardship as a daily companion, but also to sing, to fight, to believe, to build a life in defiance of all that tried to tear it down. And yes, they were flawed, proud to a fault, quick to quarrel, stubborn as the hills themselves, but they were also generous, brave, unshakably human. They fought not just against enemies, but against erasure, against the weight of history trying to grind them down. They were survivors not because they craved survival, but because the alternative was unthinkable. They danced even when the music was muffled by mourning. They carved symbols into stone even when writing was forbidden. They spoke their language in whispers when shouts might cost them their lives. In darkened corners around smoldering hearths, they taught their children who they were, so that no king, no war, no empire could make them forget. Let us remember them not as shadows in tartan or silhouettes against a battlefield, but as living, breathing souls, as children huddled by peat fires, as lovers parting beneath a war-torn sky, as elders whispering blessings before dawn, as the tired, the joyful, the terrified, the defiant. Let us remember them as us, for they are us. Their blood still moves in our veins. Their dreams of safety, dignity, belonging are our dreams. Their courage is the foundation beneath our homes. Their songs echo in our lullabies. Their wisdom lives in the lines on our grandparents' faces. Their choices ripple through our lives even now. Though the centuries stretch long, the threads remain unbroken. They are in the mist rising from the glen at sunrise, in the black-faced sheep wandering across rocky hills, in the lone piper silhouetted against the sea, in the hush that falls before a ceilidh begins, in the silence of stone ruins that once held weddings and wake songs alike. They are there, in the grain of carved wood, the stitch of tartan, the rhythm of reels, the solemn lines of ancestral prayers spoken in languages half remembered but never fully lost. They are not gone, not truly, not as long as we speak of them, not as long as we remember. Their stories are not only history, they are warnings and blessings both. They tell us what it means to belong, to fight not for conquest, but for continuity, to plant seeds whose fruit we may never eat, yet still plant them because we believe in tomorrow. And though they lie now beneath heather and stone, their spirits rise with every telling. So tonight, as the fire dims and the world grows still, hold them close. The medieval Scots, fierce, complicated, enduring, remind us of something we must never forget, that even in the darkest of centuries, the human spirit burns bright, that identity is not easily conquered, that love, land, and language are worth fighting for. Their story is not just a chapter in a dusty book. It is a living legacy, and it is ours to carry forward. So sleep now, with their voices wrapped around you like a plaid shawl. Sleep beneath their blessings. You are not alone. You never were. She imposed fasting and penance upon the faithful, forbade the marriage of priests, and gradually reshaped the rugged Celtic church until it bent under the authority of Rome. Under Margaret's stern and enduring influence, the Scottish church transformed, its wild independence clipped, its ancient customs pruned. What followed was not only theological alignment, but institutional enforcement. Any trace of heresy, pagan remnant, or folk practice that deviated from orthodoxy was ruthlessly suppressed. And in that suppression, a dark chapter was written, which trials began to rise, not suddenly, but with gathering speed. At first, it was whispers. A woman who brewed herbal cures was watched with suspicion. Another who talked to animals too fondly, or knew when rain would fall, drew wary glances. Then the whispers grew into accusations. Courts were convened, torture was applied, and under the agony of twisted limbs and burned flesh, confessions were extracted, not of truth, but of terror. Women, sometimes old, sometimes young, were forced to admit to impossible things, flying with demons, nursing familiars, cursing neighbors, laying with the devil in the forest shadows. These were not isolated events. They were sanctioned purges. In some villages, entire lineages were erased. Mothers torn from children, grandmothers buried in unnamed pits. And in town squares, the flames rose high. They were burned not because they were evil, but because they were vulnerable, because someone needed a scapegoat, because control is easier when fear rules the heart. The Church, now a fully integrated arm of Roman Orthodoxy, justified these actions as necessary for the soul's salvation and society's stability. Sinners and scoundrels alike faced punishments designed not only to correct, but to humiliate. Stocks stood at the center of every town, where blasphemers, adulterers, and the merely unlucky were confined, spat on, mocked. Branding irons burned symbols into the flesh of the condemned. Floggings drew blood from backs and shoulders. Shame became a tool of social discipline. And yet, even amid this cruelty, there were sanctuaries. Within the stone walls of monasteries, priories, and convents, the world slowed. Life inside was no paradise, but for many, it was a shelter from the storm. The monks, robed in rough wool, moved through their days in rhythm with prayer and labor. They tended gardens, copied texts, treated the sick with what knowledge they had. They offered bread to the hungry, counsel to the weary, literacy to a chosen few. Their lives were quiet, austere, and, at times, profoundly kind. The nuns, clad in starched wimples, spent hours in prayer, their soft voices rising like incense through the arches of stone chapels. They sewed garments for the poor, fed orphans left at their doors, and whispered encouragement into ears dulled by grief. For all the brutality of the outside world, within these cloisters flickered a gentler light. And then there were the great cathedrals, St. Andrew's, Glasgow, Elgin, towers of stone that scraped the sky. Built over generations, they were marvels not only of architecture but of devotion. The labor of thousands, masons, carvers, glaziers, crafted these places into living monuments. Their stained glass told stories in color for a largely illiterate public. Their soaring ceilings reminded worshippers of heaven's unreachable grandeur. Their altars held relics said to heal or bless. Their tombs housed saints and kings alike. These cathedrals were not just buildings, they were theaters of belief. And in an age when life was short and death was certain, belief was everything. Yet for all the beauty of their halls, a different kind of religion often stirred in the hearts of the people. Out in the forests, on wind-swept cliffs, beside ancient stone circles whose meanings had long been lost, people still whispered old prayers. They carried charms sewn into their clothing, They left offerings at springs said to be holy. Christianity may have conquered the land, but older ways lingered, not in open rebellion, but in quiet persistence, in habits, in memory. This blending of doctrine and custom, church and folk, created a uniquely Scottish spirituality, one shaped not only by Rome's decrees, but by wind and soil, hunger and hope. It was not always logical. It was rarely pure, but it was human. And amid this complexity, the role of the church was double-edged. On one hand, it provided the rituals that shaped a life: baptism, marriage, confession, burial. It offered meaning in chaos, structure in uncertainty. A priest's voice, even if corrupted by power, could soothe. A hymn could lift the heart. A candle lit in prayer could make darkness feel less permanent. But on the other hand, that same church wielded guilt like a weapon. It demanded obedience, feared curiosity, and often punished those who needed grace most. Education was controlled. Dissent was dangerous. Scripture was spoken in Latin, understood by few. And through it all, the hierarchy grew richer, fat on tithes, offerings, and indulgences. The people, meanwhile, continued to kneel, not always in reverence, sometimes in desperation, sometimes in protest too quiet to hear, because what else could they do? In a world ruled by iron and oath, where kings waged wars from thrones and the church claimed dominion over the soul, the common person's life was not their own. Yet in stolen moments, in lullabies sung in Gaelic, in prayers whispered beside peat fires, in bread shared beneath a twilight sky, they reclaimed something sacred, a kind of dignity the world could not take. And so it is important, as we look back, to remember not just the power of the church, but the resilience of the people. To remember that even under oppression, even when the weight of religion bent the spine, the spirit could still stand. And when it did, quietly, defiantly, it left a mark. Not in books, perhaps, but in the stories passed from grandmother to child, in the rhythm of work songs, in the pause before grace, in the flicker of a candle lit not in obligation, but in hope. Hope that one day faith might not be enforced, but chosen, that truth might be spoken in the mother tongue, that sanctity might be found not in punishment, but in love, that the church, too, might someday remember the carpenter's son who dined with sinners and wept at tombs. To the lowland Scots, the Highland clans were something other, something untamed, unruly, and strange. They looked upon the Highlanders as relics of an earlier age, wild men who clung to ancient customs with stubborn pride. The Lowlanders, with their walled towns, abbeys, cathedrals, and courts, saw themselves as modern, civil, and orderly. To them, the Highland raids, the cattle thieving, the border feuds were not just disruptive, they were barbaric, a threat to progress, a smear on Scotland's dignity. But Highlanders viewed the lowlands with equal disdain. They saw a people who had surrendered their soul, Scots in name only, who spoke English, dressed like Sassenachs, and bowed too quickly to foreign crowns and foreign churches. To the Gaels of the mountains and glens, lowlanders had forgotten what it meant to be truly Scottish. The land itself reflected this division. In the lowlands, fertile plains and growing cities hosted great cathedrals, stone keeps, and burghs bustling with merchants. These were the seats of political power and royal law. Trade flowed, gold changed hands, The king's writ ran strong, but in the Highlands there were no grand cities, just glens cloaked in mist, locks that held centuries of silence, and mountains that seemed to watch and wait. Here, survival was hard won. Life was woven into kinship, into clan loyalty, into songs passed mouth to mouth by firelight. The church came late. The crown's arm reached only weakly, if at all. In the Highlands, it was the chief, not the king, whose word mattered. And then there were the Isles, the Hebrides, scattered across the western sea like ancient stepping stones, had long been a world apart. For generations, they existed in the overlapping shadow of Norse and Gaelic influence. By the 1300s, a powerful dynasty had taken shape here, the Lords of the Isles. These men, descended from both Norse warlords and Gaelic kings, created a realm of their own. It was not a rebellion, it was a declaration that the Isles would be ruled by their own, in their own tongue, by their own laws. They did not ask permission. They carved power from the sea itself. The Lords of the Isles were more than warlords. They were kings in everything but name. They held court, minted judgment, raised armies, and controlled vast swaths of western Scotland. Their ships, sleek, fast, and deadly, patrolled the waters from Skye to Islay. They raided when they pleased, defended fiercely, and rarely bowed to Edinburgh. Their loyalty to the Scottish crown was conditional, calculated. A game of thrones played on waves and wind. They upheld Brehon law, a legal tradition older than the Roman Empire. They spoke Gaelic. They honored bardic traditions and fostered poetry. They preserved a vision of Scotland that had deep roots in the Celtic soul, a vision that the Lowlands, in their pursuit of English-style centralization, seemed eager to bury. To many Highlanders, the Lords of the Isles were not rebels. They were the rightful protectors of Gaelic Scotland. But such independence could not go unchallenged forever. The crown, ever wary of power it could not fully control, watched the lords with growing suspicion. When they grew too bold, too rich, too independent, Edinburgh moved. Slowly but surely the pressure mounted. Treaties were broken, titles questioned, land rights denied, and eventually armies sent. Yet defeating the Isles was not easy. Their geography favored defense. Their people were loyal, and their leaders were cunning. The struggle would stretch across generations. Sometimes it was fought with swords, other times with ink and marriage pacts, with bribes and betrayal. But eventually the tide turned. By the late 1400s, the crown's grip had tightened. The autonomy of the Isles began to erode. Castles once ruled by Gaelic chiefs fell under royal control. The great MacDonald lords were forced to submit, their banners lowered, their titles stripped. The kingdom of the Isles faded, not with a great final battle, but with a slow, grinding loss of authority. Yet even as the title Lord of the Isles became a hollow inheritance passed to Scottish kings, the culture they nurtured lived on. In song, in speech, in resistance, the memory of that independent Gaelic kingdom, proud, sea-washed, defiant, burned in Highland hearts long after its fall. It whispered in the rhythms of the pipes, in the cadence of old tales, in the very names of places and clans. It whispered of a time when the Highlands did not answer to distant kings, when the laws of the glen were not penned in foreign courts. And that whisper would not go silent, not through reformation, not through war, not even through fire and exile. It would smolder quietly, deep in the soul of a people who had always known how to outlast defeat. Tonight, as we near the end of this long tale, let your thoughts rest for a moment upon those coasts. Let the waves of the Western Sea carry you to a time when boats glided over black water beneath a silver moon, and warriors with wind-burnt faces stood watch from stone towers, daring the world to take what was theirs. The lords of the Isles may be gone, but their story remains, a chapter of pride, peril, and perseverance. And like the tides, it returns, always, in an age untouched by the safeguards of modern medicine. Even the mildest illness could spell death. A simple infection, a scratch from a rusted blade, a cough during winter, could spiral into a fatal affliction. And then there were the scourges: smallpox, typhoid, dysentery, and the merciless grip of bubonic plague. These diseases did not knock politely. They ripped through entire communities with unforgiving speed, snatching infants from cradles, elders from hearths, mothers from children. Villages that sang in spring could fall silent by winter. Yet in the midst of this unrelenting threat, life persisted. For the common folk, those who worked the land with hands hardened by frost and soil, each day was a battle. They rose before the sun touched the hills, dragging aching limbs from straw-stuffed bedding. Their lives revolved around the rhythm of survival, feeding livestock, cutting peat, mending tools, harvesting what the stingy earth would offer. The wind was rarely kind, and the winters cruel. Food was never abundant. Their homes low, smoky, cramped, sheltered families and livestock alike. Rats were constant companions, as were fleas and lice. Illness brewed in corners. Hunger whispered through rafters. And yet, despite it all, they carved out moments of beauty. They laughed. They loved. They found joy in things we might call small, but for them were immense. The birth of a lamb, the break in a storm, a loaf of bread that rose well, a neighbor who recovered from fever. They clung to each other with a tenderness sharpened by the knowledge that tomorrow was not promised. They celebrated the wheel of the year with unyielding spirit. Samhain, Beltane, Lammas, these ancient markers of Earth's turning were times of feasting, of fire, of song. Villagers gathered beneath moonlit skies, fiddles and pipes filling the air, children chasing shadows, lovers stealing moments beside haystacks. Bonfires burned high into the night, and for a few fleeting hours, the world seemed less harsh, more magical. Inside the dim glow of cottages, stories passed from mouth to ear like sacred relics. Tales of giants and selkies, of heroic clans and clever witches. The bard's voice became a bridge between past and present, reminding even the youngest that they were links in a much older chain. Faith, too, ran deep. Though the church might be distant and its Latin liturgies foreign, the people forged their own connection to the divine. A prayer before planting, a whispered blessing over the sick, a cross carved into the doorframe. These were not rituals of doctrine, but of intimacy, a sacred thread woven into daily life. Superstition and religion danced together, indistinguishable. Charms were sewn into children's cloaks. Rowan branches were hung above doors to ward off evil. Wells and stones were visited not for spectacle, but because generations had believed in their power. And in that belief there was comfort. Marriage was less a ceremony than a covenant, a joining of households and hands, often young, often hurried. Love came later or didn't, but still, many found tenderness in shared burdens. Children followed quickly, and with them, the ever-present worry of fever, of famine, of war. And yet they hoped. They hoped because hope was a rebellion against despair, because to give up was to die. Education was rare, but wisdom was not. Old women knew which herbs eased childbirth, which poultices soothed wounds. Old men knew the weather by the scent of wind. Children learned by watching, mimicking, listening. They learned to be strong, to be quiet, to endure. War was never far. Even in peace, its shadow loomed. Suns disappeared into levees. Crops were trampled by marching boots. Raids came swift and sudden. Families would lose all in a single night, yet begin again with nothing but each other. Injustice was expected. The law favored those with land and titles. The poor were punished for theft even when it meant survival. A man might hang for poaching a rabbit. A woman might be beaten for speaking too boldly. And still they pressed on, because their lives, though often invisible to the pages of history, were the very thread from which the nation was woven. They were not kings. They were not saints. They were not rebels whose names echoed across generations. They were the ones who buried the dead, who mended the thatch, who whispered lullabies while the wind howled outside. They were the quiet force behind everything. And so, when we speak of Scotland, of its strength, its beauty, its fire, we must speak of them, not as footnotes, but as foundation, not as statistics, but as souls, because they remind us of something we often forget, that history is not only shaped by those who wield swords or crowns, but by those who carry water, bake bread, sing lullabies, and love fiercely even when the world gives them little in return. So tonight, as the story winds toward its end, take one final moment to sit beside that ancient hearth. Hear the wind rattle the shutters, feel the fires flicker, and remember them, not with pity, but with reverence. The unnamed, the uncelebrated, the heartbeat of medieval Scotland. Children were both a blessing and a burden, tiny mouths that hungered for food, but also small hands that could harvest, herd, and haul. In the rugged balance of Highland life, their presence meant both joy and strain. A swaddled infant brought pride and promise, but also fear of fever, of famine, of frost. Few families could expect all their children to survive into adulthood, and yet they hoped because hope was the first breath of love. Boys were celebrated as potential warriors, heirs to the clan's name and strength. From an early age, they were trained to wield a blade, to guard livestock, to move through heather without sound. Girls, meanwhile, were taught how to stitch, cook, tend to younger siblings, and hold the household together. Many were married off in their early teens, often to forge alliances between families or end feuds. Consent, if considered at all, was secondary to politics and survival. But in these bonds, arranged or chosen, there could be warmth. Love sometimes grew, blooming awkwardly in the cracks of arranged duty. A touch at dawn, a glance across the hearth, laughter shared during brief moments of peace. Still, sorrow was constant. The cries of grieving mothers echoed through many glens. Death came often and came early. Some infants never opened their eyes. Others succumbed to illness in the dead of winter. A bad harvest meant empty bellies. An infection meant a grave. And still the people endured, because what else could they do? They clung to life and to the traditions that framed it. For all its brutality, the structure of clan life offered something precious: belonging. The same fierce clans that fought one another with steel also held together through kinship, through blood ties and shared burdens. Loyalty to one's name, to one's people. It was a fire that burned against the long night of hardship. And then there was faith. The Catholic Church, deeply woven into the rhythm of medieval life, offered more than ritual. It offered reason. Reason for suffering. Reason for order. Reason to keep going. Parish priests, though often stern and poorly educated, were figures of both fear and comfort. They reminded their flock that pain on earth might earn peace beyond it, that heaven waited for the meek, the obedient, the patient. Yet faith was not only dogma, it was woven into daily life. A cross traced over bread before baking, a whispered Ave Maria before sleep, bells tolling at noon to mark the Angelus. Holy days scattered through the year offered reprieve from labor, feasts, games, small indulgences. The liturgical calendar brought rhythm to a chaotic world. But fear walked alongside faith. Hellfire was not metaphor, it was preached with vivid urgency. Penance was public. A woman who gossiped might be forced to wear a bridle of iron. A man caught drunk could be flogged. Adulterers were paraded in shame. Sin was seen not only as offense against God, but as a threat to the community, a spiritual sickness that could spread. Still, amidst these harsh judgments, people found beauty. The sound of a bell drifting through morning fog, the golden glimmer of a candlelit Massachusetts, the hush before a blessing, the scent of incense drifting through stone halls. Even the poorest soul, kneeling on a dirt floor, could feel part of something larger, something eternal. Their faith was not always orthodox, not always pure by ecclesiastical standards. Folk belief mingled with Christian doctrine. Old prayers were repurposed for saints. Superstitions lingered in corners the church could not fully cleanse. A silver coin left at a holy well. A sprig of heather tied over a crib. Saints became stand-ins for older gods. Rituals carried more than one meaning, and in these blurred lines, comfort lived. The community, too, offered strength. Though hard times might breed suspicion, they more often demanded cooperation. Neighbors helped each other raise roofs, gather peat, harvest grain. When one family lost a cow, others shared milk. When disease struck a house, others brought soup and herbs, knowing the favor would someday be returned. Hospitality was sacred. A traveler might be a cousin. A stranger might be kin. Music and song stitched the social fabric together. Ballads were passed from one hearth to the next. Work songs gave rhythm to labor. Lullabies calmed restless children. Tunes were sung to honor the dead, to praise the land, to recall ancient heroes whose names still lingered on the lips of shepherds and warriors. And laughter, though not constant, was fierce when it came. Raucous, unapologetic. Celebrations erupted on saint days, weddings, the rare good harvest. Ale flowed, dances spun late into the night. For a moment, hardship stepped aside, and life surged forward with full voice and wild joy. There were festivals where young and old alike wore wreaths of flowers or holly, painted their faces, and joined in games that blurred the line between ritual and revelry. The wheel of the year turned, and with it came reasons, however fleeting, to rejoice. And as each season passed, the people adapted. They learned to read signs in the sky, the soil, the bones of animals. They adjusted planting and hunting, migration and harvest, to nature's relentless rhythm. They bent, but did not break. They grew older quickly, died young, and left behind children who would do the same. Still, they built. They built not only walls and thatched roofs, but communities, legends, lineages. They laid stones with aching hands, stitched banners with tired fingers, and carved meaning into lives that the powerful often ignored. They carved it in songs, in prayers, in love. And though they never ruled from castles or crowned themselves kings, they ruled nonetheless, over their own lives, their own hearts, their own corner of the world. So remember them, not for the dirt beneath their nails, but for the dreams that filled their nights. Not for their silence, but for the way they endured, and for the truth that still echoes in every glen and glade, that in the end, it was not sword or scripture that kept Scotland alive, but the quiet, stubborn grace of its people. The Scottish nobles, defeated and disillusioned, were compelled to bend the knee to Edward I of England. With the ink of forced allegiance still fresh, English governors took their seats in castles and halls that once echoed with Gaelic voices. Foreign law replaced custom. Foreign banners replaced clan standards. And with every passing month, the grip of conquest tightened. But it was not the nobles who bore the deepest weight of this new rule. It was the common folk. Crops were seized to feed English garrisons. Herds were driven away to supply distant armies. Villages suspected of harboring rebel sympathizers were razed, their cottages reduced to smoldering ash. Fields were trampled beneath foreign boots. Livelihoods vanished in days. And always, the threat of punishment hung in the air. Sudden, brutal, and without mercy. And yet, even in the long night of occupation, flickers of light endured. Among the abbeys and priories that peppered the Scottish landscape, sacred spaces offered shelter. Within thick stone walls, monks and nuns lit candles against the dark. They took in the wounded. They whispered prayers over the dying. They handed bread to the hungry, salves to the burned, and hope to the despairing. Though the church hierarchy often aligned with power, these cloistered corners acted with compassion, not calculation. One such beacon of light came not from within Scotland's bloodlines, but from across the sea. Her name was Margaret of Wessex, an English princess by birth. She might have been resented by the Scots, but from the moment she wed Malcolm III in 1070, Margaret gave herself wholly to her adopted land. She did not simply occupy the throne, she transformed it. Where others sought dominion, she offered devotion. Where others enforced, she healed. Margaret was no passive consort. She was a reformer, a visionary, a force. She saw a church that had grown lax, too close to pagan custom, too far from Roman standard, and set about its revival. She summoned synods. She corrected abuses. She brought in new clergy, retrained the old, and aligned Scottish rites with those of the wider Catholic world. She did not impose through violence, but through example, through piety, through persistence. And more than doctrine, she brought mercy. Margaret fed the poor from her own kitchens. She washed the feet of beggars during Lent. She founded hospitals not as showpieces for the court, but as true havens for the sick and destitute. Schools were established to educate the children of the poor, giving voice to a generation who would otherwise be condemned to silence. Her faith was not theatrical. It was intimate, woven into her every act. Even the court changed under her gaze. Coarseness gave way to civility. Justice found a stronger foothold. She brought books, illuminated manuscripts bound in velvet and gold, and placed them in the hands of bishops and boys alike. She believed that knowledge sanctified, that beauty uplifted, that the spirit needed more than bread, it needed brilliance. And though Margaret was born of royal lineage, she lived with humility. She rose before dawn to pray. She fasted when others feasted. She offered sanctuary to exiles and advocated for clemency when others demanded blood. Those who came near her, whether noble or peasant, spoke of her gentleness, of a radiance not of crown or cloth, but of character. When she died in 1093, after hearing news of her husband's and son's deaths in battle, the grief that gripped Scotland was real. Not only in the abbeys, not only in the court, but in the fields, in the crofts, in the homes of those whose lives she had touched, directly or indirectly. She was canonized in 1250, but to many, she had long been a saint already. Margaret's influence endured long after her death. Her reforms rooted deep. Her compassion set precedent. And in the darkest moments of English domination, her memory became a kind of resistance, not through violence, but through values. She reminded the Scottish people that even in defeat, there could be dignity, that kindness was not weakness, but strength in its purest form, and that a queen's power need not lie in armies or gold, but in grace. Today, her name adorns churches and chapels. Her likeness graces stained glass. But more than these, her spirit lives in every act of quiet service, in every gesture of care, in every reform made not for glory, but for good. And so, as the English yoke pressed down on Scotland, and rebellion brewed in glens and mines alike, Margaret's memory moved quietly between them all, a whispered reassurance that goodness still lived here, that Scotland, though wounded, had not lost her soul. So now our tale draws to a close. The fire flickers low. The winds outside carry no war horns, only the sigh of history fading gently into the dark. The voices we have followed, warriors and widows, queens and crofters, monks and marauders, drift quietly back into the shadows from which they came. But we do not leave them behind. We carry them, for those centuries have passed, and the tools, tongues, and temples of the land have changed. Something of them remains within us, etched not into scrolls or royal decrees, but into the marrow of memory. Scotland was never merely a nation. It was and is a mosaic of people who refused to vanish. Its strength was never just in steel or stone, but in spirit, in the way a mother tucked her child beneath a woolen blanket, whispering prayers older than scripture, in the hands of a stonemason shaping beauty from mountain bones, in the patience of a fisherman watching the sea for signs, in the laughter of children chasing each other through the heather, in the silence of a widow laying flowers beside an unmarked grave. These were lives lived between battles, between famines, between the pages of official history, and it is there, in that quiet, that the real soul of Scotland was forged, not by kings, but by kindness, not by conquest, but by community, not in the halls of power, but in the fields of toil, the songs of grief, the rituals of love. This is what endures long after crowns crumble and banners rot. This is what sings through the centuries. For every hero we remember, there were 1,000 hands that held the line in silence. For every stone we see still standing, there were backs that carried, fingers that placed, and hearts that hoped. And so tonight, as the last echoes fade, remember this, that bravery is not always loud. Sometimes, it's in the way someone stands when they'd rather flee. Sometimes, it's in forgiveness offered when the wound is still raw. Sometimes, it's in rising again when the world has pressed you flat. And in medieval Scotland, bravery was often all they had. Bravery in the face of winter, of war, of loss, of silence. And now, centuries later, you've walked those paths with them. You've sat by their fires, heard their hymns, mourned their dead. Their story has become, for a moment, your own. Carry it with you. Speak of it to others, not just the battles, but the bread. Not just the blood, but the belief. Let the names of unknown mothers, of nameless sons, of forgotten rebels and farmers live again, if only for a moment. Because remembering them is more than history. It is healing. And when you next feel alone, lost in a world too fast, too cruel, too loud, remember those who stood in colder winds than this, who lit candles in darker nights, who dreamed of you though they never knew your name. You are their legacy. You are their answer. You are the proof that they did not suffer in vain. And now, let your eyes close, soft as mist on the lock. Let their story wrap around you like a woolen shawl. Let their song, quiet and proud, carry you into sleep. You are not alone. You never were.